Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight we venture into the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the mist conceals more than beauty and the silence hides truths that defy explanation. In this episode, we will explore 8 deeply disturbing accounts that have emerged from the darkest corners of Washington and Oregon. Tales of vanishings without trace, encounters that shattered reality, and discoveries that should have remained buried beneath the moss and shadow. These stories are drawn from genuine testimonies, documented encounters and reports filed by those who survived to speak of what waits between the trees. Each narrative has been meticulously reconstructed from actual events, preserving the terror and mystery of the original accounts. To protect the identities of those involved, certain names and identifying details have been modified, but the core of each experience remains unaltered and uncompromising. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true horror content that will haunt your thoughts long after the video ends. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us begin our descent into the heart of the wilderness, where the trees remember everything and the forest never forgets. I have been a search and rescue volunteer in Washington state for 7 years now. It is not glamorous work, and most people do not realize how often we are called out to find someone who simply took a wrong turn or underestimated the wilderness. I have found lost hikers, injured climbers, and confused elderly folks who wandered too far from their campgrounds. I have been trained in wilderness recovery, first aid, navigation, and survival skills. I thought I had seen everything these forests could throw at me. I was wrong. It was October 2019 when I received the call that would change everything I thought I knew about the woods. The dispatcher explained that a woman named Jennifer had been reported missing by her friend after she failed to return from a solo overnight camping trip near Mirror Lake in the Olympic National Forest. Jennifer was 32 years old, an experienced hiker, and according to her friend, she had made this exact trip at least a dozen times before. She knew the trail, she knew the area. She should have been fine. Our team assembled at dawn the next morning. There were 6 of us, all volunteers, except for the lead coordinator who worked for the county. The October air was crisp and cold, the kind that burns your lungs when you breathe too deep. We drove to the Mirror Lake trailhead in 2 vehicles, our gear packed and our minds focused. The forest around us was dense with towering western hemlocks and Douglas firs, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even in daylight, the ground below existed in a state of perpetual twilight. When we arrived, Jennifer's car was still parked at the trailhead, exactly where her friend said it would be. The doors were locked. Through the windows, we could see her purse sitting on the passenger seat, her wallet visible inside. Her phone charger was plugged into the dashboard. These were not things an experienced hiker would leave behind if she intended to go deep into the wilderness. It was the first sign that something was not right. We divided into pairs and began hiking in. I was partnered with a woman named Claire who had even more experience than I did. The trail to Mirror Lake is roughly 4 miles from the trailhead, winding through old-growth forest that has stood undisturbed for centuries. The path is well maintained and clearly marked, but the forest itself is notorious for disorienting even experienced hikers. The trees all look the same. The moss grows so thick on the trunks that compasses can act strangely. The terrain folds in on itself in ways that make distances deceptive. We found Jennifer's campsite 3 miles in, just off the main trail near a small clearing. The moment I saw it, my stomach tightened. The tent was still standing, but the front had been torn open from the inside, not unzipped, torn. The fabric was shredded in long vertical strips as if someone had clawed their way out in a panic. Jennifer's sleeping bag was half out of the tent, dragged partway into the clearing. Her camping stove sat cold and unused. Her backpack had been opened and its contents scattered across the ground in a pattern that made no sense. Claire called the rest of the team over the radio while I examined the scene more carefully. Jennifer's belongings were not just scattered randomly. They had been arranged. Her clothes formed a rough circle around the perimeter of the clearing, each item placed deliberately with care. Her hiking boots sat in the center, laces tied together. Her water bottle stood upright next to them. Her headlamp had been placed on top of a rock, pointed toward the forest. It was as if someone had created a marker or a message, though I could not understand what it meant. The ground around the tent showed signs of a struggle. The dirt was disturbed, leaves kicked up, small branches broken. But there were no footprints that I could identify clearly. The forest floor was too covered in debris and moss to hold prints well, but I should have been able to see something. Instead, there were only vague disturbances in the earth, patterns that looked almost like something had been dragged, but without the clear furrow you would expect. I followed the disturbances away from the campsite, moving slowly and carefully. Claire stayed behind to coordinate with the rest of the team. The drag marks led deeper into the forest, away from the trail and toward a section of woods that grew increasingly dense. Every 20 yards or so, I would find another piece of Jennifer's clothing. First, her jacket, hung carefully on a low-hanging branch as if displayed for someone to find. Then her shirt, draped over a fallen log. Then her hiking pants folded and placed on top of a moss-covered boulder. I should have waited for backup. Protocol dictated that I not continue alone. But the urgency of the situation overrode my training. Jennifer had been missing for over 36 hours. If she was injured and hypothermic, every minute counted. I pressed forward, following the trail of clothing deeper into the woods. The forest changed as I went further. The trees grew closer together, the light dimmed even more. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds and insects and rustling of small animals, faded until I was walking in complete silence. It felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down on my shoulders with a weight that was almost physical. I found Jennifer's boots 200 yards from the campsite. They sat side by side on the forest floor, perfectly aligned and facing toward an area where the trees opened slightly into another clearing. Beyond them, I could see her socks, also neatly placed. Then her undergarments. Each item leading me forward like breadcrumbs, except these breadcrumbs had been left with deliberate intention. The second clearing was smaller than the first, perhaps only 15 feet across. In the center stood a formation of stones that I had not noticed on any map of the area. They were granite boulders, each roughly 3 feet tall, arranged in a circle with one larger stone in the middle. The rocks were covered in moss and lichen, clearly ancient, and they bore markings that I did not recognize. Symbols carved into the granite, worn smooth by time but still visible. They looked like they could have been Native American in origin, though I am no expert. On top of the center stone sat Jennifer's identification card and her cell phone. They had been placed with care, the ID card perfectly centered and the phone laid flat beside it. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I picked up the phone. The screen was cracked, but when I pressed the power button, it lit up briefly before dying. The battery icon showed it was completely drained, but the last timestamp I glimpsed indicated activity at 2:47 in the morning the previous night. I was about to call Claire on my radio when I heard it. A voice, a woman's voice, singing. It came from the tree line on the far side of the clearing, a melody without words, high and lilting and beautiful. For a moment, I thought it was Jennifer. I thought she was alive and nearby, and relief flooded through me. But then the voice hit a note that no human throat should be able to produce. It went too high, wavering and warbling in a way that sounded almost electronic. The melody continued, but now I could hear that it was wrong. The rhythm was too perfect, too mechanical. The tone shifted in ways that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly at the edges. I called out. I shouted Jennifer's name. The singing stopped immediately, cut off mid-note as if someone had pressed a button. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. I could not even hear my own breathing, though I could feel my chest moving rapidly with panic. Then I heard footsteps. They came from the trees, moving toward me through the undergrowth. Not running, not walking quickly, but moving with deliberate, measured steps. One after another, slow and rhythmic, crunching through the fallen leaves and snapping small twigs. I reached for my radio. Dead. The screen would not light up. I pulled out my phone. Also dead despite having a full charge when I left the trailhead an hour earlier. I looked at my compass. The needle spun wildly, rotating in full circles without ever settling on a direction. The footsteps grew closer. I still could not see anyone through the dense trees. The undergrowth was too thick, the shadows too deep. But I could track the sound as it circled around me, moving from the far side of the clearing to my left, then behind me, then to my right. Whatever was making the sound was not approaching directly. It was surrounding me. A smell hit me then, so powerful and sudden that I gagged. It was the smell of decay, of rot, of something dead and left to decompose in the damp forest for weeks. It was overwhelming, choking, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I ran. I do not remember making the conscious decision to flee, but suddenly I was crashing through the forest, sprinting back the way I had come. The footsteps behind me did not increase in speed. They maintained the same slow, methodical pace, but somehow they kept up with me. No matter how fast I ran, I could hear them behind me, matching my trajectory, never gaining but never falling behind. I do not know how I found my way back to Jennifer's campsite. The forest should have disoriented me completely, but I burst into the clearing where her tent stood to find Claire and 2 other team members waiting. They looked startled by my appearance. Claire later told me that I was pale as death, covered in sweat despite the cold, and my eyes were wide with terror. I tried to explain what I had found, where I had been, what I had heard. The words came out jumbled and frantic. I led them back toward the second clearing, retracing my path. But when we reached the area where I had found the standing stones, there was nothing. The clearing was gone. The stones were gone. The forest stretched unbroken in every direction, dense and impassable. Even the items of clothing I had followed, the jacket and shirt and pants that had been hung and draped and folded so carefully, had vanished. We searched for 2 weeks, the full team, plus additional volunteers, plus cadaver dogs, plus park rangers who knew every inch of the Olympic National Forest. We covered over 30 square miles of wilderness, searching in grids, calling Jennifer's name until we were hoarse. We found nothing. No body, no additional clothing, no signs of struggle beyond what we had documented at her campsite on that first day. The only physical evidence we recovered was Jennifer's phone and identification card, which I had brought back with me from the clearing that no longer existed. The phone was sent to a forensics lab. They managed to extract some data from it despite the damage. The last photo Jennifer took was time-stamped at 2:47 a.m., exactly what I had glimpsed on the cracked screen. The image showed nothing but darkness. Complete, total blackness. But the metadata indicated that the flash had fired. Whatever the camera had been pointed at had absorbed all the light. I spoke with a local Native American elder a few weeks after the search was called off. He listened to my story without interruption, his weathered face impassive. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he told me that the area around Mirror Lake has always been considered forbidden by his people. He said there are places in the forest where the boundary between worlds grows thin, where things that should not exist can cross over. He called them the forest takers. He said they have been taking people for as long as anyone can remember, and that those who are taken are never found because they are no longer in our world. I requested a transfer after that. I could not continue working search and rescue in that area. I could not walk those trails knowing what I knew, hearing those footsteps in my memory every time the forest grew too quiet. I still volunteer, but now I work in the mountains east of Seattle, far from the dense coastal forests of the Olympics. Jennifer was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. Her case remains open, but no one is actively searching anymore. Her friend holds a vigil every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. I attend when I can, though I never tell anyone what I really saw and heard that day. They would not believe me. Sometimes I do not believe myself, but I know the truth. Jennifer did not get lost. She did not fall and injure herself and succumb to hypothermia. She did not have a medical emergency or a mental break that caused her to wander away from her campsite. Something took her. Something deliberate and intelligent and completely beyond our understanding. Something that left a trail for me to follow, that sang with a voice that should not exist, that walked with footsteps that defied explanation. Some people are not meant to be found. Some forests do not give back what they take. And some places in this world are marked as forbidden for very good reasons. I learned all of this that October morning in the woods near Mirror Lake. I learned that there are boundaries we should not cross, clearings we should not enter, and voices we should not follow, no matter how beautiful they sound. I still hear that singing sometimes late at night when I am trying to sleep. It echoes in the back of my mind, perfect and mechanical and utterly wrong. And I know that somewhere deep in the Olympic National Forest, those standing stones are still there, waiting for the next person to find them, waiting for the next name to add to their collection, waiting in the silence between the trees where the forest keeps its darkest secrets. I have been exploring abandoned places for about 5 years now. It started as a casual interest, something to do on weekends when I needed to escape the monotony of my office job. Over time, it became more than a hobby. It became an obsession. I document forgotten locations across Oregon, places that time has left behind. Old hospitals, closed schools, defunct industrial sites, ghost towns swallowed by the forest. I photograph them, map them, research their histories, and share what I find online. Most of the time, these places are exactly what they appear to be, empty buildings slowly being reclaimed by nature. But sometimes you find something that should have stayed lost. It was my friend David who sent me the coordinates. He had found them on an obscure forum dedicated to Oregon history, posted by someone who claimed to have stumbled across an abandoned logging camp from the 1960s while hunting. The post was vague on details, but mentioned that the camp appeared to be completely intact, as if the workers had simply vanished one day. For someone like me, that was irresistible. David and I made plans to check it out on the first weekend in May 2021. When the weather would be clear enough for the drive into the mountains. The coordinates led us to a location in the Coast Range, about 40 miles from the nearest town. We took David's truck because my sedan would never have made it on the logging roads. The drive itself took nearly 3 hours, the last hour spent bouncing along rutted dirt tracks that had not seen maintenance in decades. Trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against the truck with sounds like fingernails on glass. We parked where the road became completely impassable, blocked by fallen trees and washouts. From there, we hiked. I had my camera, my phone, a GPS unit, water, and basic supplies. David carried similar gear plus a first aid kit because he is more cautious than I am. The forest was beautiful that morning, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden shafts, birds singing, the air clean and fresh with the smell of pine and damp earth. We found the camp 2 miles in. The trail we followed was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and salal, but it was definitely a trail. Someone had cut it once, and we were simply following the path of least resistance through the undergrowth. When we emerged into the clearing where the camp sat, I actually gasped. It was bigger than I expected. Much bigger. There were 8 main structures, 4 bunkhouses, a mess hall, an equipment shed, a garage, and a small building that looked like it might have been an office. All of them were built from rough-cut timber that had weathered to a silvery gray. The roof sagged in places and moss grew thick on every surface. But the buildings were intact. No graffiti, no signs of vandalism, no evidence that anyone had been here in years. What struck me immediately was how much had been left behind. The camp looked operational, as if the workers had simply walked away in the middle of a shift. In the equipment shed, we found chainsaws, axes, wedges, and other tools hanging on the walls or lying on workbenches. In the garage, there was an old logging truck with flat tires and a cracked windshield, but otherwise complete. The bunkhouses contained beds with mattresses that had rotted through, footlockers with rusty locks, and shelves still holding personal items, books, photographs, ashtrays, empty whiskey bottles. David and I split up to explore more efficiently. He took the bunkhouses while I headed for the mess hall. The building was the largest in the camp, with a commercial kitchen on one end and rows of tables on the other. The kitchen was a disaster, with pots and pans scattered across the floor, drawers pulled open, and a massive iron stove that had tipped forward off its base. The tables in the dining area were covered in debris, fallen ceiling tiles, bird nests, and the accumulated dirt of decades. On one of the tables, I found a calendar. It was one of those old promotional calendars given out by equipment companies, with a picture of a logging truck at the top and the months below. The last page that had been torn off was August 1967. September 1967 was still attached, but the rest of the months after that remained in the booklet, never used. Someone had stopped tearing off pages in August, and then the calendar had sat here for over 50 years. I took photographs of everything: the kitchen, the calendar, the scattered personal items in the bunkhouses, the ancient logging equipment. Every image documented another piece of the mystery. Why had this place been abandoned so suddenly? Why had no one come back for the valuable equipment? Why did it feel like the people who worked here had left in a panic? David called out from one of the smaller buildings. I walked over to find him standing outside what we had assumed was an office. The door was closed and had a padlock on it, old and rusted but still secure. David had a pry bar in his pack. We looked at each other, both of us knowing we were about to cross a line. Technically, we were already trespassing. Breaking into a locked building made it worse. But we had come this far, and I needed to know what was inside. The lock broke easily, the rust having weakened it beyond functionality. The door swung open with a long, drawn-out creak that echoed across the empty camp. Inside, the office was small and cramped, dominated by a metal desk and filing cabinets. The air was thick with dust, and our footsteps left clear prints on the floor. No one had been in this room for decades. On the desk sat a logbook and a leather-bound journal. The logbook was official, filled with entries about board feet harvested, equipment maintenance, and personnel schedules. I flipped to the last entries, all dated late August 1967. The handwriting was neat and professional, noting routine information about production quotas and shift rotations. Nothing unusual. The journal was different. It was personal, clearly kept by whoever had been in charge of the camp, probably the foreman. The entries started out normal, discussing the work, the weather, complaints about supply deliveries. But as I flipped forward through the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting became less neat, more hurried, and the content grew disturbing. An entry from mid-August mentioned that several men had reported seeing something in the trees at night. Something large, they said, watching the camp from just beyond the reach of the lights. The foreman dismissed it as a bear or elk, nothing to worry about. 2 days later, another entry. One of the men had not returned from a solo shift in the northern cutting area. A search party went out at dawn and found his equipment, but no sign of him. The foreman noted that the man had a history of drinking and speculated he might have wandered off drunk and gotten lost. A week later, 2 more men were missing. The journal entry for that day was longer and more frantic. The foreman wrote that the remaining workers were terrified, that they refused to go into the woods alone, that they were talking about abandoning the camp. He had radioed for assistance from the main office, but communication had been difficult. He mentioned strange interference on the radio, voices that should not have been there, static that sounded almost like whispering. The second to last entry described something the foreman had seen himself. He wrote that he had been in the mess hall late one night doing paperwork when he heard all the men in the bunkhouses suddenly go silent. The usual sounds of conversation and activity stopped all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. He went outside to investigate and saw it. His description was vague, almost incoherent. He wrote about something tall standing at the edge of the clearing, something with too many limbs that moved wrong, something that turned its head toward him and made him feel like his mind was being pulled apart just by looking at it. The final entry was dated September 2nd, 1967. It consisted of only 2 sentences. It came into camp last night. We are leaving at dawn. I showed the journal to David. His face went pale as he read the entries. We stood in that dusty office, the late morning sun filtering through the dirty windows, and felt the weight of what we had discovered. This was not just an abandoned camp. This was the site of something terrible, something unexplained, something that had driven an entire crew of experienced loggers to flee into the wilderness. That was when we heard it, the sound of an engine starting. It came from outside, from somewhere in the camp, a deep rumbling growl of diesel machinery coming to life. David and I looked at each other, frozen. There was no power here. There had not been power in this camp for over 50 years. The sound was impossible. We moved to the window and looked out. The logging truck in the garage had not moved, and I could see through the open garage doors that it was still sitting on flat tires. But the engine sound continued, joined now by other noises. The whine of a chainsaw, the clang of metal on metal, the distant shout of men calling to each other. The sounds of an active logging camp echoing through the empty clearing. Movement caught my eye at the tree line. A figure stood there, barely visible in the shadows beneath the branches. It was too far away for me to make out details, but the shape was human. A man in work clothes, it looked like, wearing the kind of gear loggers wore in the 60s. Heavy canvas pants, suspenders, a flannel shirt. He stood perfectly still, facing toward the camp, toward the office where David and I watched from the window. Then he raised his arm. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand and beckoned. "Come here," the gesture said. "Come join us." More figures emerged from the forest. They appeared between the trees, materializing out of the shadows like they had been there all along and we had simply failed to notice them. 3, then 5, then 8, then more than I could count, all of them in old work clothes, all of them standing motionless, all of them facing the camp. David grabbed my arm. His grip was tight enough to hurt. "We need to go," he said. His voice shook. "We need to go right now." The figures began to move, not walking exactly. They advanced toward the camp, but their movements were wrong, too smooth, too coordinated, like they were floating just slightly above the ground rather than stepping on it. They moved in unison, all at the same pace, closing the distance between the forest and the buildings. We ran. David and I burst out of the office and sprinted toward the trail that would take us back to the truck. Behind us, the sounds of the phantom logging camp intensified. Chainsaws roared, men shouted, trees crashed to the ground with thunderous booms. But when I glanced back over my shoulder, the camp was still empty. The building stood silent and abandoned. The sounds had no source. The figures followed us into the forest. I could see them between the trees as we ran, keeping pace with us through the undergrowth. They never made a sound. No footsteps, no breathing, just the soft rustle of branches as they passed through them, moving impossibly fast for beings that seemed to be drifting rather than running. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. My lungs burned, my legs ached. David was ahead of me, his longer stride giving him an advantage, but he kept looking back to make sure I was still behind him. The trail was treacherous, roots and rocks waiting to trip us, but we did not slow down. We could not slow down. The figures stayed with us for the first mile, then gradually fell back. The sounds of the phantom logging operation faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. Birds sang. A squirrel chattered from a branch overhead. The wind rustled through the leaves. By the time we reached the truck, we were alone. We did not speak during the drive back to civilization. David gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes fixed on the road. I sat in the passenger seat shaking, trying to process what we had experienced. It was not until we reached the highway, back in the realm of cell phone service and other cars and normalcy, that David finally broke the silence. "We are not telling anyone about this," he said. I agreed. Who would believe us? But when I got home that evening and downloaded the photos from my camera, I saw things I had not noticed while taking the pictures. In the background of several shots, barely visible but definitely there, were figures. Men in old work clothes standing just inside doorways or at the edges of the frame. They appeared in photos taken before we heard the engines, before we saw them at the tree line. They had been there the entire time we were in the camp, watching us waiting. I spent weeks researching the camp. I found old county records that confirmed a logging operation had existed at those coordinates from 1963 to 1967. The company that owned it went bankrupt shortly after the camp closed. I found obituaries for some of the men who worked there, but many others simply vanished from the historical record. There were rumors, scattered mentions in local newspapers of disappearances and strange occurrences, but nothing concrete. The official story was that the camp shut down due to financial difficulties. The unofficial story, whispered in bars and around campfires, was that something in those woods drove the loggers away. I do not explore abandoned places in the Pacific Northwest anymore. I stick to urban locations, buildings in cities where there are people nearby and help is a phone call away. David moved to California 6 months after our trip to the logging camp. He said he needed a fresh start, but I know the real reason. He could not stop thinking about those figures in the forest, those workers who never left, who still tend their phantom camp deep in the mountains where no one goes anymore. Sometimes I think about going back. Part of me wants to return with better equipment, more people, and try to document what we experienced in a way that would convince skeptics. But a larger part of me remembers the way those figures beckoned, the invitation in that raised hand, the promise of joining them in whatever existence they now inhabit. Those workers never left. They are still there, cutting trees that are not there, living lives that ended over 50 years ago, waiting in the shadows of that abandoned camp. And they want company. They wanted us to stay. I think if we had remained in that camp just a little longer, if we had not run when we did, we would still be there too, standing at the tree line, beckoning to the next curious explorers who stumble across coordinates on an obscure forum, adding our voices to the phantom sounds of an operation that never ended, even after everyone left. The camp is still there. The coordinates are still online, and the workers are still waiting. I consider myself an experienced day hiker. I am in my mid-30s, reasonably fit, and I have been hiking trails throughout Oregon and Washington for the better part of a decade. I know how to read maps, I carry the essentials, and I respect the wilderness. I have encountered black bears, aggressive elk, and even a mountain lion once from a safe distance. I have dealt with sudden weather changes, twisted ankles, and getting temporarily turned around on unmarked trails. None of those experiences prepared me for what happened on Eagle Creek Trail in July 2022. Eagle Creek Trail is one of the most popular hiking routes in the Columbia River Gorge. It follows Eagle Creek through a stunning canyon, past multiple waterfalls with views that attract thousands of visitors every year. I had hiked it before and wanted to do it again, but I chose a Wednesday in mid-July specifically to avoid the weekend crowds. I started early, arriving at the trailhead just after 7 in the morning when the parking lot was nearly empty. The first few miles were exactly as I remembered them. The trail hugs the canyon wall, narrow in places with drops into the creek below that would be fatal if you slipped. But the path is well maintained and clearly marked. The forest is dense, primarily Douglas fir and western red cedar, with moss covering everything in shades of green so vivid they almost hurt to look at. The sound of the creek rushing over rocks provides a constant background melody. Around mile marker 4, I passed 2 other hikers heading back toward the trailhead. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, commenting on the beautiful weather. They mentioned they had started at dawn and were heading back to beat the heat. After they passed, I was alone on the trail. Completely alone. That was exactly what I wanted. 10 minutes after passing those hikers, I heard whistling behind me. It was faint at first, just barely audible over the sound of the creek. A tune without words, melodic but unfamiliar. My first thought was that another hiker had started up the trail behind me and was whistling to pass the time. I am not someone who needs constant silence in the wilderness, so I did not mind. I kept walking, but as I continued, I noticed something strange. The whistling maintained the exact same distance behind me. It never got closer, never fell further back. It stayed maybe 50 yards behind, constant and unchanging. I adjusted my pace, walking faster to see if the whistler would catch up and pass me. The whistling remained 50 yards back. I slowed down significantly, thinking maybe the person behind me was also slowing down to maintain their own comfortable pace. The whistling stayed exactly where it was. I stopped completely and turned around. The trail behind me was empty. I could see at least 100 yards back to where the path curved around a rocky outcropping. There was no one there. The whistling had stopped the moment I stopped walking. I stood there for a full minute, listening, scanning the forest. Nothing, just the creek and the birds and the wind in the trees. When I started walking again, the whistling resumed within seconds. Same tune, same distance, same volume. I felt the first tickle of unease in my stomach. I pulled out my phone to check if I had service, thinking I might call someone just to hear another human voice. No bars. I was in a dead zone, which was not unusual for this trail. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Sound carries strangely in canyons. Maybe there was another hiker on a different section of the trail, and the acoustics were making it seem like they were behind me. Maybe it was an echo of some kind, though I could not figure out what would be creating it. Maybe it was a bird. Some birds can produce remarkably musical sounds, but I knew it was not a bird. The melody was too complex, too deliberately structured, and it was mimicking my rhythm. When I walked faster, the tempo of the whistling increased slightly. When I walked slower, it slowed to match. Whatever was producing that sound was aware of me and responding to my movements. I decided to turn around and head back. I had planned to hike another 3 miles to Tunnel Falls, but the situation felt wrong enough that I abandoned that plan. I would rather be overly cautious than ignore a warning sign. The moment I turned around and started walking back toward the trailhead, something changed. The whistling was now in front of me. Not behind me anymore, but ahead, coming from the direction I was now walking. That was impossible. I had turned around instantly. Nothing could have moved from behind me to in front of me that quickly, not without me seeing it pass. The trail was the only viable route. The terrain on either side was too steep and rocky for rapid movement. I stopped again. The whistling continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically, but logic was becoming difficult to hold on to. That is when I saw the shadow. It moved through the trees to my left, parallel to the trail. Just a dark shape glimpsed between the trunks, there for a second and then gone. But in that second, I registered that it was tall, much taller than a person, 8 feet at least, maybe more. And it moved too fluidly, gliding between the trees rather than walking or running. The whistling changed. The melody distorted, becoming electronic sounding, like it was being played through a synthesizer with a broken speaker. The notes went sharp and flat in rapid succession, creating a sound that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. It was no longer pleasant or musical. It was wrong in a way that bypassed rational thought and went straight to some primal fear center in my brain. I left the trail. It was a stupid decision, the kind of thing that gets hikers killed in the wilderness, but staying on the trail meant staying near that thing in the trees. I crashed through the undergrowth on the uphill side, away from the cliff edge, climbing through ferns and over fallen logs. Branches whipped at my face. Thorns tore at my clothes. I did not care. The whistling came from multiple directions now, ahead of me, behind me, to both sides. I was surrounded by it, that distorted electronic melody echoing through the forest from every angle. I kept climbing, gasping for breath, my legs burning with effort. The terrain was steep and treacherous, nothing like a maintained trail, but terror gave me strength I did not know I had. I broke through onto another section of the trail, maybe 200 yards uphill from where I had left it. 2 hikers were there, a couple in their 20s wearing matching backpacks. They looked startled when I burst out of the forest, wild-eyed and bleeding from dozens of small cuts. The whistling stopped, instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, reaching out to steady me as I stumbled onto the path. I tried to explain. The words came out jumbled and frantic. I told them about the whistling, about the shadow in the trees, about how I had been followed. They exchanged worried glances. The man asked if I had seen anyone else on the trail that morning. I described the 2 hikers I had passed earlier. He nodded and said they had seen those same 2 people in the parking lot. "We have not seen anyone else," he said gently, "and we have not heard any whistling." They offered to hike out with me, clearly concerned that I was injured or experiencing some kind of medical emergency. I accepted gratefully. The 3 of us walked back to the trailhead together, and the entire time I felt exposed and vulnerable. Every shadow between the trees caught my attention. Every sound made me flinch. But the whistling did not return. When we reached the parking lot, I thanked them profusely. My car was the only vehicle there besides theirs. The 2 hikers I had passed early that morning were long gone. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive, and the couple waited nearby until I finally started my engine and pulled out. I researched Eagle Creek Trail that evening and discovered stories I had never heard before. Local legends about something called the Whistler, an entity that has been reported in the Columbia River Gorge for decades. Descriptions vary, but common elements include the whistling sound, the sense of being followed, and glimpses of something too tall to be human moving through the forest. Several missing persons cases in the area have never been solved. Hikers who set out alone and never returned, their bodies never found despite extensive searches. I will not hike alone anymore. I will not return to Eagle Creek Trail no matter how beautiful the waterfalls are. And when I do hike, I pay attention to sounds in a way I never did before. Because I know now that not everything in the forest is what it seems. Not every sound has a natural explanation. Whatever was out there on the trail that day, it was playing with me. It could have caught me at any point during my panicked flight through the undergrowth. It could have taken me long before I reached that other section of trail where the couple was hiking. But it did not. It wanted me afraid. It wanted me running. It wanted to see how far I would go before I broke. And I think I got lucky. I think if those hikers had not been there when I burst back onto the trail, the whistling would have continued. It would have surrounded me until I was too exhausted to run anymore. And then I would have become another missing person, another unsolved case, another name added to the long list of people who walked into the Pacific Northwest wilderness and never walked out. The Whistler is still out there, still following hikers on lonely trails, still playing its distorted melody, still waiting for someone who does not get lucky. My best friend Scarlett disappeared 3 years ago, and I have not stopped looking for answers. We grew up together in Portland, went through school together, navigated our 20s as roommates trying to figure out life. She was more than a friend. She was the sister I never had. Scarlett was a nature photographer, talented and passionate about capturing the Pacific Northwest in all its raw beauty. She spent most weekends alone in the wilderness with her camera, returning with images that would take my breath away. Ancient forests, misty coastlines, wildlife in their natural habitats. She lived for those moments of perfect light and composition. In September 2020, Scarlett told me about a location she had found. Someone had mentioned it online, a section of old-growth forest in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington that was supposedly spectacular. She showed me satellite images of the area, dense canopy unbroken for miles, and she was practically vibrating with excitement about the photography opportunities. She planned to go alone as always for a 2-day trip. She would camp overnight and shoot during the golden hours at dawn and dusk. We texted the morning she left. She sent me a photo of her car loaded with gear, adding a message that said she would check in when she got back Sunday evening. That was our routine. She would go off-grid for her trips, and I would hear from her when she returned to cell service. I thought nothing of it when Sunday came and went without word. Service was spotty in the mountains. Sometimes she would not get a signal until she was halfway home. But when Monday morning arrived and I still had not heard from her, I started to worry. I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. I sent texts that showed as undelivered. By Monday afternoon, I was frightened enough to call the police. They told me I needed to wait 48 hours before filing a missing persons report. I did not wait. I called the Forest Service, explained the situation, and gave them the coordinates Scarlett had shown me. They found her car Tuesday morning at a remote trailhead. The vehicle was locked. Her purse was on the passenger seat with her wallet inside. Her phone charger was plugged into the dashboard. But all of her camera equipment was gone, including her main camera body, 3 lenses, her tripod, and her camera backpack. Her camping gear was also missing. It looked like she had unloaded everything and headed into the forest exactly as planned. The search lasted a week. Rangers, volunteers, and search dogs covered the area within a 5-mile radius of the trailhead. They found no trace of Scarlett, no abandoned campsite, no dropped equipment, no signs of injury or struggle. It was as if she had walked into the forest and simply ceased to exist. The official conclusion was that she had gotten lost and succumbed to exposure or injury in a location they had not yet searched. The case remained open, but active. Searching stopped. I could not accept that. Scarlett was too experienced, too careful. She always told someone where she was going. She carried navigation tools and emergency supplies. She would not have just gotten lost. I convinced the police to give me access to her cloud storage accounts. All of her photos automatically backed up to the cloud whenever her camera synced with her phone, which she did religiously every evening to free up space on her memory cards. The photos were there. Hundreds of them from that weekend, all time-stamped and geotagged. I went through them chronologically, watching Scarlett's journey unfold through images. She had arrived at the trailhead Saturday afternoon based on the timestamps. The first photos showed the forest from the parking area, dramatic afternoon light filtering through the canopy. Then the trail itself winding through massive trees. The photographs were beautiful. Scarlett had found exactly what she was looking for. A pristine old-growth forest with trees that must have been 500 years old. Ferns covered the forest floor, moss draped from branches. Everything was green and lush and untouched. She had captured it perfectly. But as I progressed through the photos, I started to notice something in the background. In a shot of a particularly massive Douglas fir, there was a shape between the trees behind it. Just a dark blur, probably nothing. I almost missed it. 3 photos later, there it was again. A dark vertical shape, indistinct but definitely there, visible between 2 trees about 30 yards behind Scarlett's main subject. I kept going through the images and the shape appeared more frequently, always in the background, always distant, but with each appearance it seemed slightly closer. Scarlett had not noticed it. The figure, if that is what it was, never appeared in her foreground. She had been focused on composition and light, not on what was happening behind her subjects. The timestamps showed the progression. Over the course of 30 minutes on Saturday evening, that shape appeared in 47 consecutive photographs. Scarlett had been moving through the forest, stopping frequently to frame shots, and something had been following her. Moving through the dense undergrowth, keeping pace with her, getting closer. One photograph showed it clearly. Scarlett had taken a shot looking down a corridor between trees where the light was particularly beautiful. In the background, perhaps 50 feet away, was a humanoid figure, tall and dark, standing perfectly still, arms at its sides. The image was not sharp enough to make out details, but the proportions looked wrong. The limbs were too long. The head was too large. It did not look like a person wearing dark clothing. It looked like something else. The final clear photograph Scarlett took was of the forest floor. The image was tilted out of focus, showing moss and fallen leaves and nothing else. The metadata said it was taken at 7:42 p.m. Saturday, just before sunset. After that, there was one more file that had uploaded to the cloud. Not a photo, an audio file, 8 seconds long. I almost did not play it. Some part of me knew that whatever was on that recording would change everything, would make Scarlett's disappearance real in a way it had not been before. But I had to know. I put in my earbuds and pressed play, heavy breathing, ragged and terrified. Then Scarlett's voice, barely a whisper, "Please no." A dragging sound, fabric on rough ground, the audio cut off. I sat in my apartment and cried for an hour before I could compose myself enough to call the police. They took the evidence seriously this time. The photos and audio file proved that something had happened to Scarlett. They organized a new search focused on the area where the geo-tagged photos clustered. 2 days later, they found her camera. It was 2 miles from the trail in a section of forest so dense that the search teams had not reached it during the initial effort. The camera body had been deliberately destroyed. Someone or something had smashed it against rocks until the casing cracked and the sensor shattered. But more disturbing was the memory card. It had been removed from the camera. Whoever destroyed the equipment had taken the time to eject the card first. The ground around the camera showed signs of a struggle: disturbed earth, broken branches, drag marks in the moss. But there was no blood, no tissue, no evidence that would allow for DNA analysis. And despite extensive searching in that immediate area, they found no other trace of Scarlett, no clothing, no other equipment, nothing. I started researching. I needed to understand what had happened, even if it meant diving into territory that most people would consider crazy. I discovered that the area where Scarlett disappeared was known locally as a problem zone. 3 other people had vanished in a 5-mile radius since 1995. All of them were solo hikers, all of them were never found. And interestingly, 2 of the 3 were photographers. I found online forums where people discussed strange encounters in that section of forest. Reports of being followed. Sightings of something tall moving between the trees. Feelings of being watched so intense that experienced outdoors people fled back to their cars. The Forest Service had no official comment on these reports, but park rangers I spoke to off the record admitted that they avoided that area when possible. I hired a private investigator who specialized in missing persons cases. He took my money, did preliminary research, and then called me 2 weeks later to tell me he could not work the case. He would not give me specific reasons, just said that the area made him uncomfortable and he did not feel he could conduct a proper investigation. He refunded half of what I had paid him. I sent the photographs to several experts in wildlife photography and image analysis. They confirmed what I already knew. The figure in the background of Scarlett's photos was not a bear, not an elk, not any known animal. The proportions did not match human anatomy either. One expert suggested it might be an elaborate hoax, someone in a costume following Scarlett for reasons unknown. But that made no sense. Why would someone stage something like that and then destroy the camera? Why take the memory card if they wanted the images to be found? The case remains open. Scarlett is officially listed as missing, presumed deceased. Her parents held a memorial service last year on the anniversary of her disappearance, though there is no body to bury. I attended and said nothing about what I had found in those photos. They did not need that burden. I maintain a social media page dedicated to Scarlett's case. I post updates. I share her photographs. I keep her name in public view because I believe that attention is the only thing that might lead to answers. Sometimes people reach out with theories or their own experiences in that forest. Most of it is noise, but occasionally someone shares something that feels important. Someone knows what happened, or something does. Those photographs prove that Scarlett did not simply get lost. She was followed. She was hunted. And at some point between that final photograph and that 8-second audio file, something took her. I will never stop looking. I will never accept the official explanation, because I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. I have heard my best friend's terrified whisper in those final seconds, and I know that whatever is in that forest, it is still there, still waiting for the next photographer to wander into its territory with a camera and good intentions. I was a park ranger in Oregon's Coast Range for 8 years. It was not the most prestigious posting in the Forest Service, but I loved the work. The forests there are temperate rainforests, dense and primal and beautiful in a way that feels ancient. Most days involved routine patrols, checking trail conditions, educating visitors, and occasionally dealing with illegal camping or minor safety issues. It was peaceful work, the kind of career that let you feel like you were protecting something important while also having time to appreciate where you were. November 2021 was when everything changed. I was working the evening shift on a Tuesday, covering the district alone because budget cuts had reduced staffing to skeleton levels during the off-season. Tourism drops dramatically in November. The weather turns cold and wet, the days grow short, and most people stay away until spring. I did not mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. Just me in the forest. Around 6 p.m., just after sunset, I received a radio call from dispatch. A day hiker had reported seeing what looked like an active campsite in a restricted zone about 4 miles from the main visitor center. The restricted zone existed for good reasons: unstable terrain, hazardous cliffs, and a history of accidents. We had signs posted at every access point. Anyone camping there was either ignorant of the rules or deliberately ignoring them. I loaded my gear into the truck and drove to the nearest trailhead. The restricted area was accessible by an old fire road that had been gated off years ago. I unlocked the gate, drove through, and locked it behind me. Protocol dictated that I not go in alone, but calling for backup would mean waiting hours for another ranger to arrive from a different district. If someone was camping illegally in a dangerous area, I needed to get them out before full darkness set in. The fire road was overgrown and rough. Branches scraped the sides of the truck. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating moss-covered trees and thick undergrowth. It took 20 minutes to reach the point where the road became impassable even for a 4-wheel drive vehicle. From there, I continued on foot. The trail to the restricted zone was barely a trail anymore. I followed what had once been a maintenance path, using my flashlight to pick out the route. The forest pressed in from all sides, silent except for the occasional drip of moisture from the canopy. No animal sounds, no wind, just that heavy, damp silence that makes you feel like you are the only living thing for miles. I found the campsite exactly where the hiker had described it. A tent stood in a small clearing illuminated by my flashlight beam. A fire pit had been built with stones arranged in a circle, though no fire was currently burning. The coals were still warm when I checked them. Food supplies sat on a makeshift table constructed from a flat piece of wood balanced on 2 stumps. Personal belongings were scattered around the tent: a backpack, a sleeping bag aired out on a log, some cooking equipment, but no people. I called out, identifying myself as a ranger and explaining that they were camping in a restricted area. My voice echoed strangely in the clearing, as if the forest was swallowing the sound. No response. I called out again. Still nothing. I approached the tent slowly. Protocol required that I not enter without permission, but the situation was odd enough that I needed to verify no one was injured inside. I unzipped the tent and shone my light in. Empty. The interior showed signs of occupancy. A sleeping pad laid out, clothes in a stuff sack, but no person. That was when I noticed the trees. The ones surrounding the clearing had marks carved into their trunks. Not casual graffiti or the initials that teenagers sometimes carve. These were symbols, deliberate and complex, cut deep into the bark. They formed a pattern around the entire clearing, each tree bearing a different symbol, but all of them connected by their placement. I am no expert in symbolism, but these looked old, like something from indigenous cultures, or perhaps something older than that. The symbols made the campsite feel less like an illegal camping situation and more like something else entirely. Something deliberate and planned. I pulled out my radio to call dispatch and request backup. The radio produced only static. I checked the battery. Full charge. I changed channels. More static. My radio had worked perfectly 15 minutes earlier on the drive in. I tried my cell phone. No service, which was expected in this area. But when I looked at the screen, the phone was behaving strangely. The clock display was flickering, the time jumping forward and backward randomly. The battery indicator dropped from 80% to 20% as I watched. Movement caught my attention at the edge of the clearing. I spun around, flashlight raised. Nothing there. just trees and darkness. But I had definitely seen something shift in my peripheral vision, a suggestion of motion among the trunks. Then I heard them. Voices. Multiple voices speaking in unison, chanting in a language I did not recognize. The sound came from deeper in the forest, moving closer. I could see lights now, flickering between the trees, torches or lanterns carried by multiple people approaching the clearing. I stepped back toward the trail I had come from, suddenly very aware that I was alone in a restricted area with no working radio and no backup. The voices grew louder. I could make out at least 5 or 6 distinct speakers, maybe more, all chanting the same rhythmic phrases. Figures emerged from the forest. They wore robes, dark fabric that blended with the shadows, and their faces were covered with masks. Crude masks that looked handmade with eye holes cut into wood or bark. They entered the clearing from multiple directions, moving with purpose toward the fire pit at the center. I should have identified myself. I should have demanded they explain what they were doing in a restricted area, but something about the scene paralyzed me. This was not a group of hippies doing some harmless pagan ritual. This felt dangerous in a way I could not articulate. I backed further into the shadows at the edge of the clearing and crouched behind a fallen log. The figures formed a circle around the cold fire pit. There were 8 of them. The chanting continued, rising and falling in volume, the words foreign and harsh. The central figure, taller than the others, stepped forward and produced something from beneath their robe. A knife, large and curved, the blade catching what little light existed from the lanterns. This had gone far beyond illegal camping. I was witnessing something that could be a crime in progress. I needed to get back to my truck, drive to where my radio would work, and call for police backup. I began to retreat slowly, moving as quietly as possible through the undergrowth. I stepped on a branch. The snap echoed across the clearing like a gunshot. The chanting stopped instantly. All 8 figures turned toward where I crouched in the darkness, in perfect unison, as if they were all controlled by a single mind. The central figure removed their mask. What I saw beneath it was not a human face. The features were wrong. Too many eyes, dark and reflective like an insect's compound eyes. A mouth that extended too far across the face, opening to reveal teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. I tried to tell myself it was another mask, a second layer of disguise, but the face moved with muscular precision. It was not a mask. The figure pointed directly at me with one elongated finger. The others began moving toward my position, not running but walking with that same synchronized movement. I ran. I crashed through the forest, abandoning any attempt at stealth, focused only on getting away. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating trees and undergrowth in chaotic fragments. Behind me, I heard sounds that should not have been possible. Screeching like metal grinding against metal, but organic somehow, coming from throats that were producing sounds no human throat could make. The robed figures pursued me, and though I could not see them clearly in the darkness, I could hear them moving through the forest with unnatural speed. I do not know how I found my way back to the truck. Pure panic and muscle memory guided me through the darkness. When I burst out onto the fire road and saw my vehicle sitting there with its reflective Forest Service markings, I nearly sobbed with relief. I threw myself into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The figures emerged from the forest as I was putting the vehicle in reverse. They stood at the edge of the fire road, motionless now, watching as I backed away at dangerous speed. I kept my eyes on them in the rearview mirror until I rounded a curve and they disappeared from view. My radio crackled to life the moment I was a mile from the restricted area. Dispatch was calling, asking for a status update. I reported what I had seen in the most professional terms I could manage. I called it a possible cult activity requiring police response and requested immediate backup to meet me at the gate. By the time backup arrived along with 2 sheriff's deputies, an hour had passed. I led them back to the clearing. The campsite was gone. Not abandoned, gone. The tent, the fire pit, the supplies, the personal belongings, all of it had vanished. Even the symbols carved into the trees were no longer visible. The deputies checked the trunks with their flashlights and found smooth bark, unmarked except for the natural patterns of growth. I tried to explain. I took photos with my phone of the area where the campsite had stood. Nothing showed in the images but undisturbed forest floor. I described the figures, the masks, the central figure's face. The deputies and the other ranger exchanged glances that I understood perfectly. They thought I had imagined it or was making it up. I wrote a detailed report. My supervisors read it and sent me for a mandatory psychological evaluation. The counselor was professional and kind, and I could tell she thought I had experienced a stress-induced hallucination. I did not argue. What could I say that would convince anyone? I resigned 2 months later. I could not continue working in those forests knowing what I had seen, knowing that it was still out there. The official reason I gave was career change, new opportunities. The real reason was that every time I went on patrol, I found myself watching the tree line, waiting to see robed figures emerge from the shadows. I do not know what they were. Cult members who somehow cleaned up their sight with impossible speed. Entities that exist in those restricted zones. Something else entirely. But I know what I saw that night was real. The face beneath that mask was not human. And whatever ritual they were preparing to perform in that clearing, I interrupted something that should never be witnessed. The restricted zone remains restricted. The signs stay posted. And somewhere in those woods, in clearings that appear and disappear, things are happening that we are not meant to see. Last summer, my boyfriend Carter and I decided to drive up the Oregon coast for a romantic getaway. We had been together for 2 years and wanted to celebrate our anniversary with something special. The plan was simple: rent a nice hotel somewhere along the coast, spend a few days exploring tide pools and coastal trails, eat seafood, and just enjoy being together away from our normal lives in Eugene. It should have been perfect. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. We left on a Friday afternoon in August 2023, driving north on Highway 101 with the windows down and music playing. The weather was beautiful when we started, clear skies and warm temperatures. But as we drove further north, the weather changed. Clouds rolled in from the ocean, heavy and dark, and by the time we reached the stretch of highway between Yachats and Florence, it was raining steadily. We had not booked a hotel in advance, preferring to be spontaneous and stop wherever felt right. But as the evening wore on and the rain intensified, we started looking more urgently for a place to stay. The small coastal towns we passed through all had no vacancy signs lit up. Apparently, everyone else had the same idea about a weekend getaway. Around 9 p.m., frustrated and tired, Carter suggested we try taking one of the Forest Service roads inland. Sometimes there were small motels or lodges tucked back in the woods that catered to fishermen and hunters. They were not fancy, but they would have availability. I was skeptical, but we were running out of options. The next major town was another 40 miles away. Carter turned onto a narrow paved road that cut east into the forest. The GPS showed it as an unnamed county road. Our phone signal dropped almost immediately. The road was in poor condition, cracked and potholed, winding through dense forest that pressed in from both sides. The rain made visibility terrible. Our headlights barely penetrated the darkness and the downpour. After 20 minutes of driving, the pavement gave way to gravel. Carter slowed down, navigating carefully. I was about to suggest we turn around when the car made a horrible coughing sound and the engine died. Carter coasted to the side of the road and tried to restart it. Nothing. The engine would not turn over. All the dashboard lights were on, showing we had battery power, but the starter would not engage. Carter got out to check under the hood despite the rain. I stayed in the car, watching him through the windshield as he examined the engine with his phone flashlight. After a few minutes, he got back in, soaked and frustrated. He could not identify the problem. We would need a tow truck, which meant we needed cell service. We sat there discussing our options when I heard it, a child crying. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof. A high, keening wail that sounded heartbroken and terrified. I grabbed Carter's arm and told him to listen. He went quiet, and after a moment he heard it too. The crying seemed to be moving around the car, circling us. First it came from the left, then from behind, then from the right. I could not pinpoint a location. Carter suggested it might be an animal, a cougar or a bobcat. They can sound eerily human, but this was not an animal sound. It was a child, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sobbing in the rain in the middle of nowhere. Carter wanted to investigate. I absolutely did not. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong. But he pointed out that if there really was a child out there, lost and scared, we could not just sit in the car and do nothing. He was right, logically. But logic did not account for the feeling of pure dread that had settled into my stomach. I looked out my window, trying to see anything through the rain-streaked glass. The headlights were still on, illuminating a small section of the road ahead. And there, standing directly in the beams, was a figure, a child in a white dress, small and thin, standing perfectly still in the pouring rain. I gasped and grabbed Carter's arm again. He looked where I was pointing and saw her too. We both sat frozen, staring at this little girl who should not have been out here alone. She was not moving, not crying anymore, just standing there facing the car. The rain should have been soaking her, but somehow she looked dry. The white dress was not clinging to her body the way wet fabric should. Carter reached for the door handle. I begged him not to get out. Something was wrong. Everything about the situation was wrong. But he was insistent. He could not leave a child standing in the rain. He opened the door and stepped out, calling to her. The child did not respond. She continued standing motionless in the headlights. Carter took a few steps toward her, moving slowly and speaking in a gentle voice, trying not to frighten her. I watched through the windshield, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When Carter was about 10 feet away from her, the child's head began to turn. Not her body, just her head. It rotated smoothly, impossibly, a full 180 degrees until she was facing backward while her body remained facing forward. Her face came into view in the headlights. It was not a child's face, it was an adult woman's face, pale and gaunt with eyes that were too large and a mouth that was stretched into a rictus grin showing too many teeth. Carter stumbled backward with a shout. The thing that was not a child opened its mouth impossibly wide and the crying sound came out again. But distorted now, electronic and wrong, cycling through different pitches like a siren. More figures emerged from the forest on both sides of the road, all of them identical, all wearing white dresses, all with that same pale, wrong face. I screamed at Carter to get back in the car. He ran, and I reached across to unlock his door as he yanked it open and threw himself inside. He locked the doors immediately, and we both sat there gasping as the figures surrounded the vehicle. There were at least a dozen of them. They formed a circle around the car, standing perfectly spaced, facing inward. The crying had stopped. Now they were all screaming in unison, that same distorted electronic sound cycling up and down in pitch. The sound was so loud it hurt. I covered my ears, but it did not help. Carter tried the ignition again. The engine turned over immediately and roared to life as if it had never malfunctioned. He did not question it. He threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator. We surged forward, driving straight at one of the figures blocking our path. It did not move. We were about to hit it when it simply was not there anymore. Gone. We drove through the space where it had been standing and accelerated down the gravel road. I looked back through the rear window. The figures were still standing in their circle, motionless now, watching us leave. As we put distance between us and them, they faded from view, swallowed by the darkness and rain. Carter drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. We followed the gravel road for another 15 minutes until it reconnected with a paved highway. Neither of us recognized where we were, but there were road signs and we found our way to the nearest town. We checked into the first hotel we found, a small place that looked like it had been built in the 1970s but was clean and safe and full of normal people. We did not sleep that night. We sat on the bed with all the lights on, drinking coffee from the machine in the room, not talking about what we had seen. The next morning, Carter examined the car thoroughly. There was nothing wrong with the engine, no mechanical issues at all. It started perfectly and ran smoothly. Before we drove home, I looked up legends about the Oregon coast. I found multiple references to something called the Weeping Woman, a spirit or entity that appears on remote roads during storms. The stories go back decades, maybe longer. She appears as a child in distress, luring people out of their vehicles. Those who follow her are never seen again. The forest consumes them. We cut our trip short and drove home that same day. When we got back to Eugene and could examine the car in good light, Carter noticed something that made both of us go cold. There were handprints all over the vehicle, small handprints like a child's, pressed into the dust and pollen on the paint. But the hands that made them had too many fingers. 6 on each hand, clearly visible in the prints. Carter washed the car immediately, scrubbing every inch of it until no trace of those prints remained. We did not talk about that night for months afterward. It was too unsettling, too far outside our understanding of how the world works. Eventually, we broke up. The relationship could not survive the weight of what we had experienced together. Every time we looked at each other, we were reminded of those figures in the rain. I think about it often. What would have happened if Carter had gotten closer to that thing before its head turned? What would have happened if we had gotten out of the car together? What would have happened if the engine had not started when we needed it to? The Weeping Woman wanted us. She and her identical sisters wanted us to follow, to step out into the rain and join them in whatever existence they inhabit. We were lucky. We recognized the danger just in time. We stayed in the car. We escaped. But I know that entity is still out there on remote forest roads, crying in the rain, waiting for the next travelers to take a wrong turn, waiting for someone who does not recognize the danger until it is too late. And I wonder how many people have not been as lucky as we were. How many have followed the crying child into the forest and never come back. I have been a hunter for as long as I can remember. My grandfather taught me when I was 12 years old, passing down traditions and skills that his father taught him. Hunting is not just a hobby for me. It is a way of connecting with nature, of understanding the rhythm of the wild, of participating in something ancient and elemental. I respect the animals I hunt. I use what I take, and I follow all the rules and regulations that govern ethical hunting practices. In October 2022, I was bow hunting in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. I had scouted the area during the summer and found a location that showed excellent signs of deer activity. Rubs on trees where bucks had scraped their antlers, well-worn game trails, fresh droppings. Everything indicated this was a productive spot. I had been hunting this particular forest for 15 years without incident. I thought I knew it as well as anyone could know a wild place. I arrived at my spot well before dawn, hiking in by headlamp with my bow and pack. The October air was cold enough that I could see my breath and frost crunched under my boots. I had set up a tree stand during the summer, a climbing stand that I positioned about 20 feet up in a large Douglas fir that overlooked a natural funnel between two ridges. Deer traveling through the area would pass within shooting range if I remained still and silent. I climbed the tree in darkness, moving slowly and carefully. Every sound I made seemed amplified in the pre-dawn quiet. Once I reached my platform and secured myself with my safety harness, I settled in to wait. This is the part of hunting that most people do not understand. It is not action and excitement. It is patience and stillness. You become part of the forest, breathing with it, existing in its rhythm. As the sky began to lighten, I noticed something unusual. The forest was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no small animals rustling through the undergrowth. In 15 years of hunting these mountains, I had never experienced silence this absolute. There is always sound in the forest, even in the depths of winter, but this morning there was nothing. Just an emptiness that felt wrong on a fundamental level. I told myself it was just an anomaly. Sometimes predators in the area will cause other animals to go quiet. A cougar or bear passing through will silence the forest temporarily. But as the minutes passed and the silence continued, my unease grew. This was not the cautious quiet of prey animals hiding from a predator. This was the absence of all life. Full daylight arrived and the silence persisted. I could see clearly now, scanning the forest floor and the surrounding trees. Nothing moved. Not a single squirrel, not one bird flying between branches. The forest looked normal but felt dead, like I was sitting in a perfectly preserved diorama rather than a living ecosystem. Then I saw the deer. A doe and two younger animals, probably her offspring from the previous spring, entered the clearing below me. They moved normally at first, browsing on low vegetation, their ears rotating to catch sounds. I watched them through my binoculars, not yet ready to draw my bow. I prefer to wait for a mature buck, and I was not interested in shooting a doe with young animals depending on her. The deer suddenly froze, all three of them simultaneously, as if someone had pressed pause on a video. They stood completely motionless, staring at the tree line to my left. Their bodies were rigid, every muscle tense. I followed their gaze but saw nothing except trees and shadows. Then, as suddenly as they had frozen, all three deer bolted. Not a casual retreat but pure panic flight, crashing through the undergrowth with complete disregard for stealth or safety. In seconds they were gone, and the forest returned to that oppressive silence. I turned my attention to the tree line where the deer had been staring. Movement caught my eye. Something was there emerging from between the trees. At first I thought it was another hunter. Then I thought it might be a bear walking upright. But as the figure moved into better light, I realized it was neither. The shape was humanoid, roughly man-sized but wrong in ways I struggled to process. It moved across the clearing below me with a gait that was too smooth, too fluid. Humans bob slightly when we walk. Our weight shifts. This thing glided, as if floating a few inches above the ground. It was covered in dark hair or fur, but the texture looked wrong. Too uniform, too sleek. I raised my binoculars with shaking hands and focused on the figure. The details I saw made no sense. The proportions were off. The arms were too long. The head was too large and seemed to sit directly on the shoulders without a visible neck. And when it turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of its face. The face was human-like but distorted. The eyes were too large and placed too far apart. They caught the morning light and reflected it back, glowing faintly. The mouth was too small, just a slit in the flesh. I could not make out a nose in any conventional sense. The entire face had a quality that reminded me of something melted and reformed. Features that were almost right but fundamentally wrong. The creature stopped in the middle of the clearing and appeared to sniff the air. Its head moved in small, jerking motions like a bird or reptile rather than a mammal. I remained absolutely still, controlling my breathing, praying it would not look up and see me in my tree stand. Then it did look up, directly at me. Those oversized eyes locked onto my position with absolute certainty. There was no gradual searching, no scanning of the area. It knew exactly where I was despite my camouflage and elevated position and scent control measures. It tilted its head at an unnatural angle, studying me. My phone, which was in my jacket pocket, began to malfunction. I could feel it vibrating rapidly against my chest, heating up uncomfortably. When I risked a glance at it later, I found that the phone had been completely fried. The screen was cracked from internal pressure and the device would never work again. My watch had stopped as well, the hands frozen at the exact time the creature had looked at me. The creature took a step toward my tree, then another. It moved with that same gliding motion, crossing the distance with impossible speed while appearing to move slowly. In what felt like seconds but must have been longer, it was at the base of my tree, 20 feet directly below me. It placed one hand on the trunk. I say hand, but it was not really a hand. The appendage had too many joints, too many segments. The fingers, if they could be called fingers, were impossibly long and thin. As it pressed against the bark, I heard a sound like wood beginning to crack under pressure. The tree began to shake, not violently at first, just a trembling that traveled up the trunk and into the platform where I sat. I gripped my bow with one hand and the tree with the other, holding on as the shaking intensified. There was no wind, nothing that should cause a tree this size to move. But it was swaying now, the platform bucking beneath me like I was on a ship in rough seas. The creature stood at the base, one hand on the trunk, and somehow it was generating enough force to shake a tree that must have weighed several tons. The physics of it made no sense. Nothing about this made sense. I was beyond rational thought now, operating on pure survival instinct. The shaking continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. I held on with everything I had, my arms aching, my legs cramping from the constant adjustment to keep my balance. The creature never moved, never made a sound, just stood there with its hand on the tree, looking up at me with those glowing eyes. Then it stopped. The tree went still. The creature removed its hand from the trunk and stepped back, still watching me. After a long moment, it turned and walked away, gliding back across the clearing and disappearing into the forest from which it had emerged. I waited in the tree for another hour, too terrified to move. When I finally worked up the courage to climb down, I found something that made my blood run cold. The bark where the creature had placed its hand was burned, not charred like fire damage, but discolored and cracked as if subjected to intense heat. The handprint was clearly visible, each of those two long fingers leaving a distinct impression in the damaged wood. I took photographs of the print with my destroyed phone's camera, which somehow still functioned despite the phone itself being dead. The images are corrupted, showing strange artifacts and distortions, but the handprint is visible. I have shown them to other hunters, to wildlife experts, to anyone who might offer an explanation. No one can tell me what could have caused that damage or what kind of animal has hands with that configuration. I hiked out immediately, not bothering to retrieve my tree stand or any gear I could not carry. I wanted nothing more than to be away from that forest. The entire hike back to my truck, I felt watched. The silence persisted. No birds sang. No animals moved. Just that dead, empty quiet that had preceded the creature's appearance. I have not hunted in that forest since. I have not hunted anywhere in the Cascades. I stick to eastern Washington now, open country where you can see for miles, where there are no dense forests that might hide something like what I saw that morning. I know what I saw was real. The destroyed phone and watch prove something happened. The photographs prove the handprint existed. But I have no explanation for what it was. Not a bear, not a person, not any known animal. Something that should not exist but does, living in the deep forests where humans rarely go, moving through the wilderness like a ghost. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of those secrets are better left undiscovered. I am an avid mountain biker, and 2 years ago I was exploring new trails in some of the most remote sections of the Oregon Coast Range. Finding and mapping unofficial trails has been a passion of mine for years. There is something deeply satisfying about discovering paths that exist outside the official trail systems, routes that only a handful of people know about. These are the trails that offer true solitude, where you can ride for hours without encountering another soul. It was April 2023 when I set out to explore an area I had identified using satellite imagery. The terrain looked promising, with what appeared to be old logging roads that might provide interesting riding. I went alone, which I now recognize was my first mistake. I always carry emergency supplies, a GPS unit, and I inform someone of my general location. But that day, I was vague about where I was going, telling my roommate only that I would be somewhere in the Coast Range and would be back by evening. The trailhead, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a wide spot on a Forest Service road where I could park without blocking traffic. Not that there was any traffic. I had not passed another vehicle in the last 30 miles. I unloaded my bike, checked my gear, and set off down what appeared to be an old logging road that showed up on no maps. The first few miles were excellent riding. The road was overgrown but still passable, winding through dense forest with occasional views of distant ridges. I stopped frequently to check my GPS and mark waypoints, building a map as I went. The road gradually climbed, gaining elevation as it followed the contours of the mountainside. Around mile 7, I noticed something unusual. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Not bicycle tires, but ATV or motorcycle tracks. Recent enough that the edges were still sharp and had not been eroded by weather. I stopped and examined them, curious about who else was using this remote road. The tracks led further up the mountain, and my curiosity got the better of my caution. I wanted to see where they went. I followed the tracks for another 2 miles until I reached a point where the road appeared to split. The main branch continued in the direction I had been traveling, but a secondary branch veered off to the left, heading into denser forest. The ATV tracks took the secondary branch. The entrance to this branch had been deliberately obscured. Someone had cut branches and arranged them across the path to make it look impassable, but the tracks went right through them. Every instinct I had told me to turn around. This was clearly private property or someone's attempt to keep people away from something they did not want discovered. But curiosity is a powerful force, and I convinced myself that just a quick look would not hurt. I wanted to know what was down that path. I hid my bike in the underbrush off the main road and continued on foot. The secondary path was narrow and winding, clearly designed to be difficult to find and harder to follow. More branches had been arranged to obscure the route, and in several places I had to push through deliberate obstacles. Whoever created this path did not want visitors. After about a quarter mile of hiking, the path opened into a clearing, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a compound, multiple structures, several vehicles including ATVs and a truck, and people moving between buildings with clear purpose. This was not a hunting camp or a casual dwelling. This was organized and fortified. I crouched behind a large fallen log and observed. The perimeter had been cleared of undergrowth, creating an open zone around the buildings that would make it difficult for anyone to approach unseen. I counted at least 3 people visible, all men, and at least 2 of them were carrying firearms openly. Not hunting rifles. These were tactical weapons, the kind you see in military or law enforcement contexts. The structures themselves were interesting. One appeared to be a main dwelling, a cabin built from rough lumber. 2 others were clearly storage or work buildings. But the 4th structure caught my attention. It was a metal building, like a shipping container or prefabricated warehouse with no windows and heavy doors. Ventilation pipes extended from the roof, and I could hear the hum of generators running somewhere nearby. As I watched, a man emerged from the main cabin wearing a hazmat suit. He walked to the metal building, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and went inside. Another man, also in protective gear, came out carrying what looked like industrial chemical containers. They moved these to the storage building with careful, deliberate movements. My mind was racing through possibilities. Drug labs seemed most likely. Methamphetamine production requires chemicals and generates toxic fumes, which would explain the hazmat suits and the remote location. But something about the setup felt more sophisticated than a typical rural drug operation. The security was too good. The equipment was too extensive. This was a professional operation with significant resources. I knew I needed to leave and report this to authorities. Whatever was happening here, it was far beyond anything I should be investigating alone. I started to back away slowly, keeping low behind the log. That was when I made my second mistake. I stepped on a branch. The snap echoed across the clearing like a gunshot. One of the armed men's head turned immediately toward my position. He raised his radio and spoke into it. I did not wait to hear what he said. I ran, crashing back through the obstacles on the path, no longer concerned with stealth. Behind me, I heard shouting and the sound of ATV engines starting. I reached my bike and threw myself onto it, pedaling as hard as I could back down the logging road. The terrain was rough and the road was a downhill, which gave me speed but also made the ride incredibly dangerous. I could hear ATVs behind me, their engines screaming as they pursued. Mountain biking had given me skills that saved my life that day. I knew how to navigate rough terrain at speed. I knew shortcuts and lines through obstacles that the ATVs could not follow. When the road switchbacked, I cut straight down the slope, catching air over drops that would have been reckless under any other circumstances. The ATVs had to follow the road, which bought me distance. The chase lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. I could hear them behind me, coordinating over radios, trying to predict where I would emerge. But I knew the terrain better than they did. I had spent the ride up memorizing landmarks and studying the forest. I used that knowledge now, taking risks that paid off, widening the gap between us. When I reached the steepest descent, I made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. Instead of following the road, I plunged into the forest, riding through underbrush and over obstacles at breakneck speed. The ATVs could not follow. I heard them stop at the point where I left the road, their engines idling as the riders decided whether to pursue on foot. I did not stop. I rode until I could not hear them anymore, then I hid. I found a large hollow log and crawled inside, dragging my bike in after me. I stayed there for over 2 hours, listening to the sounds of searchers moving through the forest nearby. They were systematic, organized, using radios to coordinate their search pattern. At one point, someone passed within 10 feet of my hiding spot, close enough that I could hear him breathing. They were looking for me with an intensity that confirmed my suspicions. Whatever they were doing at that compound, it was illegal enough to justify hunting down a witness. If they caught me, I would not be walking out of that forest. As darkness approached, the search seemed to pull back. I waited until I could no longer hear any sounds of pursuit. Then I crept out of my hiding spot and made my way back to where I had left the main trail. I rode in the dark without lights, using moonlight to navigate until I reached the Forest Service road where my car was parked. There was a vehicle parked near mine, a black SUV with no visible markings. Someone sat in the driver's seat, silhouetted against the dashboard lights. I hid my bike in the trees and waited, watching. After an hour, the SUV left. I waited another 30 minutes before I approached my car, half expecting someone to jump out and grab me. The drive to the nearest town with a police station took 45 minutes. I walked in covered in dirt and blood from dozens of small cuts, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my driver's license when they asked for identification. I told them everything I had seen. They listened and took notes, but I could tell they were skeptical until I showed them the GPS coordinates and the waypoints I had marked. Federal agents interviewed me the next day. DEA or FBI, they did not specify which. They asked detailed questions about the compound layout, the number of people, the vehicles, the structures. They took my phone, saying they needed it for evidence. They told me I had done the right thing by reporting it, but that I should not have gone there in the first place. 3 days later, I saw news coverage of a raid in the Coast Range. The reports were vague, mentioning only that federal agents had conducted an operation at a remote location. No details were provided about what they found or who was arrested. When I called the agent who had interviewed me, he told me the compound had been empty when they arrived. No people, no vehicles, no equipment, just empty buildings and no evidence that anything illegal had occurred. They returned my phone a week later. All of my photos had been deleted. The GPS waypoints that would have marked the location of the compound were gone. When I asked about this, I was told it was standard procedure for an ongoing investigation. I was advised in language that was polite but very clear to forget what I had seen and to consider how lucky I was to have gotten away. I moved to a different state 1 month later. My decision was motivated partly by a job opportunity, but mostly by the black SUV that I noticed parked on my street 3 separate times in the 2 weeks following the raid. It was never the same parking spot, but it was always within sight of my apartment. No one ever approached me, but the message was clear. They knew where I lived, and they wanted me to know they knew. I do not mountain bike in Oregon anymore. I do not explore remote trails looking for hidden routes. And I pay very close attention to my surroundings, watching for vehicles that appear too frequently or faces that I see in multiple locations. Because I know what I stumbled onto that day was something far more dangerous than a simple drug operation. The resources required to evacuate an entire compound in less than 3 days, to clean a site so thoroughly that federal agents found no evidence, to track down and monitor a witness in multiple locations, that suggests organization and funding at a level that terrifies me. Whatever they were doing in that compound in the trees, someone powerful wanted it kept secret, and they were willing to kill to protect that secret. I got lucky. I had better bike skills than the men chasing me. I made the right decision to hide instead of trying to outrun them. But luck runs out, and I have no interest in testing mine any further. The compound is gone now, but I know others exist. Hidden in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, protected by isolation and violence, are operations that we are not meant to discover. And the people running them do not leave witnesses.